Shakil, you worked with different organizations exploring the future of health, future of education, and future of work, looking into 2030 and 2040 time horizon. Will you please share with us how future thinking and foresight approaches can really influence policymaking and, most importantly, reforms?
Sure. Thank you. And just thank you everyone for giving me the opportunity. It's also Eid Mubarak, so a greeting to you all for that. And and I think one thing to note that, of course, there are very many different ways in which we can influence policymaking reform. And I think I'd like to also echo Kamal sir's point on not relying on traditional forms of master planning, but then trying to apply dynamic forms and then being people focused, even in our approach of facilitation and gathering, right? And I think futures thinking, this field, and if you noted that every time I say futures thinking, I'm going to use it in plural because there's not just one future, there are multiple different futures and there are alternative futures. And of course, some futures are more likely to happen and some are less likely to happen. And then how do we actually bring about that conversation in the policymaking room is one thing that we futurists nowadays call ourselves facilitators. We're not fortune tellers, right? We also call ourselves game designers because we are really quite cognizant of how we actually allow people to interact with each other in the room. And sometimes I feel that it's not the content of the master plan that's most important, or the content of the futures report that comes out is most important, but the process that we go through on how we engage with each other. And you'll notice that, of course, in futures thinking, we usually have a slightly longer timeline in which we think about not 1,000 years into the future necessarily. I mean, of course, there's macro history, but then 20 to 40 futures is a good timeline that we look at. But of course, I understand a lot of systemic policy planning is on a 5 years or at least a 10 years basis. But at least futures thinking allows us to think about these different scenarios and help us to sort of backward plan that, okay, like if this is going to happen in 2050, or this is what we want in 2060, needs to happen in 2030, 2025, and now. And like I said, like irrespective of the work we did with our Prime Minister's office on the futures of education, or whether it's the futures of health with BRAC, I mean, I think one thing that we always noted is that who's not in the room and who do we need to be in the room. And I think, I mean, of course, policymakers are important, but even the people who are always making us think about new worldviews, like even if it's philosophers or intellectuals, even if it's storytellers, these are also important people that can also be potentially in the room. We'll come back to that point, Bama, probably later on in our conversation. But I think I just want to probably and kind of wrap up on this note that when it comes to like policy making, I mean, of course, there are these regular conversations that we have about the future, but I feel like a lot of the methods and approaches that at least I'm aware of in the futures thinking field really helps us to think about scenarios that we haven't really focused on. And I'll note that the name of my entity is called Ridiculous Futures, because the idea is that any useful statement about the future should at first appear to be ridiculous. And I think sometimes it's important that we have conversations about things that may sound weird. Like even if COVID-19 might have sounded weird 5 years ago to a lot of people, even if scientists were telling us that it's going to happen, right? And I think even now with climate change, you can see that people are telling us that it's going to happen. But to some people, it might just seem like a distant reality. But of course, it's important that all of us in the room, including the policymakers, everyone starts thinking differently, so that at least we can think about novel and new ways to even act in the present. So I'll just stop there for now. Yeah.
Thank you, Shahil. You mentioned about the worldviews and thinking differently. And a lot of the futurists talk about the importance of narratives to change these worldviews. So how would you frame the strategic foresight helping to form these alternative narratives to engage different stakeholders?
Thank you for that. So I think, I think my very first exposure to the field, and I recognize that the field of foresight and future thinking might seem pretty new to a lot of people. It's a trending topic indeed, but I think my very first experience was in 2012 when I think a futurist named Sohail and Inatullah. We did a workshop on the futures of BRAC University, for example, in 2030 back then. And I think we follow this process called the 6 pillars of future studies. And I think there's one particular powerful tool that I guess you guys can even Google up later on called causal layered analysis. That really helped me think about, like, we use the metaphor of an iceberg, that whatever's happening around us, like whatever news headlines we see, like that's the tip of the iceberg. So like the video of what was happening in the Philippines is really what's on the surface, right? The disasters that are happening, the people that are mobilizing. And a lot of the times when we want to like address disasters, we come up with new systems and new policies, but we see that sometimes we might have well-intentioned policies that don't get implemented. And I think the reason why is that causal layered analysis helps us think about, to go deeper into the layers of the iceberg, that there are particular worldviews and philosophies that if they remain the same, then even if you come up with new systems, things won't change. So for example, when it comes to violence against women, as long as we have a male part patriarchal worldview, right, irrespective of what policies we shift, the reality does not change. And I'm sure even Naomi Klein might even talk about in her book, right, This Changes Everything, that there are particular worldviews. Like if it's a profit-focused worldview all the time, then things won't change, right? You may come up with new systems, but if you're just hoping that unbridled capitalism will help everything, that's her perspective, then things won't change. That's just an example. But of course, we talk about this shift in mindset and shift in worldviews. How does that change? And that comes the deepest layer of the iceberg is stories, is myths and metaphors, right? So there are particular stories and culture that help shift our mindsets. So if the story that men are better than women or men are stronger than women will always lock you into the patriarchal mindset, right? Or the story that that money is best, right? It will probably think about, will put you into a particular mindset. So the story needs to change, right? The story has to shift from probably that everyone has rights on this planet, everyone is equal, irrespective of who you are, or the story that our incentives or our notions of success in life have to be not just driven by profit, but even by whether it's gross national happiness or gross national inspiration. There can be other ways in which we can measure this world. And I think futures thinking in this particular case is really helping us also talk about that what sort of elements in our culture are help perpetuating the systems that we cannot change, right? And I think that's a novel way that we don't usually talk about in those rooms.
Right. Thank you, Shakil.